Coming to you live, but not really. It is all pomp and no circumstance with Ryder Richards on LetUsThinkAboutIt.com, the amateur hour you should never tune into.
Hello and welcome back. This is Ryder Richards with Let Us Think About It. So I've been pretty busy lately, but I have carved out some time, and we're going to have 3 episodes coming up pretty back to back over the next couple weeks. So that's going to be great. Now, what I'm chatting about today is really doubting the intellect, even though the name of the show is Let Us Think About It, right? I often think that maybe we're not thinking hard enough with all of us. And so we're going to be looking into things like the right brain and embodied perception or embodied cognition. Now, hopefully this will give you some tools to consider how you move through the world on a daily basis. And I kind of mean that literally, because moving, after all, it's a means of perceptual thinking or cogitating. And getting out of your head back into your body, yeah, I know that sounds like it might be soft or whatever, but it's really quite useful, it's beneficial, and it's increasingly backed up with a lot of hard data. So today, we continue considering the world inside of our head as quite a narrow space to be versus even the world of your body. It's not that much further away, right? And we're going to be pulling heavily from Matthew Crawford, as we have been for the last few episodes, but also Iris Murdoch and Ian McGilchrist. And we're going to be looking a bit at this kind of mind-body split, this weird notion that we get into sometimes that myself is the voices in my head, right? Of course, I was reading Alan Watts the other day, and he reminded me that we often say things like, I have a body, when what we ought to be saying is, I am a body, right? Our language kind of messes us up there. And we think things like, well, if I lose my leg, I'm still me. But really, how much of us do we have to lose before we're no longer me? Yeah, and of course, for me, my mind instantly went into sci-fi. I was thinking about altered carbon and thinking about things like re-sleeving. Does the physiological and chemical makeup of the body you're sleeved into actually change your personality? Well, yes, the answer is just yes, it does. So this is kind of a funny thing to think about, like how the body is constituted, right? And then we also get into this idea of is the we, me somehow located in the head? Right? Is there like a little man or a woman or maybe a homunculus or a demon that's in there? And it's like watching out of our eyes and it's giving orders. Now, of course, in this view, the body is merely an extension that reports to and enacts the brain's commands, and the body is a type of machine that's controlled from on high. Yet, of course, we're going to contradict this and actually say that the body constitutes itself and in many ways is more reliable and honest than this little man-woman-demon thing that's between our ears who actually just pretends to be in control. Now, the bigger problem is here that inside of our heads is the same place we go to do things like logic and math, right? So whenever we go there for answers, it feels like we're going into a rational place. It feels like we're making or finding truth. But often we kind of mistake our beliefs and we claim them as truth. Yet really everything that's coming from up there are really illusions that conveniently reshape themselves to support our desires, which unfortunately are often influenced externally by things like propaganda and advertising. Now, a small caveat as we go through the episode, when I talk about things like rationality or logic here, I'm mostly referring to the cultural tendency to champion what Alan Watts calls the Cartesian net. Now, this is this idea that we throw a net or a grid over the world, it's latitude, longitude, it's dividing it up so we can easily quantify and measure things. And of course, we do this internally to ourselves as well, right? We claim objective logic's cachet, and then we get to suppose solidity within ourselves. So we end up borrowing this kind of infallible objective truthiness of logic and math and science. The rationality or logic has a solidity to it that we really crave. And of course, this is reacting against the world that we live in. We live in a scary world that isolates.
Part 1. How we got here.
Philosophically speaking. Now, Descartes, he ends up saying, I think, therefore I am. And of course, this sounds really great, right? It's short, it's pithy. But of course, as we have mentioned previously on the show, it privileges a guy sitting alone doing mental processing, right? And guys alone thinking, we should know by now this is how we get problems, right? So it's like, hey, listen, society, don't leave men alone. They're fragile and they tend to go crazy easily. Yeah, so the strength of humans might actually be our ability to communicate and share knowledge. We actually consider other people's knowledge to be our own. That's how we work as a species. Now, the biggest illness we may have is getting locked inside of our own thought processes, inside of our own heads. But culturally, somewhere along the way, objective rationality won, and we ended up splitting or dividing the human into parts. I mean, categorically speaking, right? Not literally. So one part is the rational self, and the other part is the will, or the moral drive. And here's how this worked. So for instance, you're out on the street and you observe facts. A banana peel is laying on the street. Now you bring that data into yourself, and you make a determination. If I step on that banana peel, I might slip, right? And then you're going to act on this. Do I avoid the banana peel or do I pick it up so no one else slips on it? Now, this action, your response to this data you collected, is going to be observable to everybody, so your morality is on display socially. What kind of person are you, you selfish peel dodger? So notice, there's nothing in here really about the body except obeying the dictates of the mind, right? The body here is just observed enacting your virtues. The body is, if anything, is really not rational, and it's historically maybe a body's even evil. I mean, who knows? It's at least lustful, and who really wouldn't be with all those banana pills laying around? Yeah, but we must ask, where really did the soul reside back then, back in these days? I mean, maybe it had to live, like, I don't know, sequestered inside your spleen to avoid all that bodily lust. Who knows? I don't know. I'm not a theologist. I'm just a podcaster. Okay, but more importantly for today, notice how this determination of who you are, it ends up kind of paralleling this scientific method. First we collect data, and then we develop a theory, and we finally test it with an observable reaction, and then we have our results. Now, as Iris Murdoch says, philosophy in the past has played the game of science, partly because it thought it was science. So she said this back in the 60s, and she pointed out that philosophy and psychoanalysis are actually not science, even though they try to be, right? They are much more broader and about human nature, but they tend to, once again, sort of borrow from science and some of the sciencey security of logic, right? They're pretending to be secure and logical. But Murdoch says philosophy and psychoanalysis cannot preclude the inner self or morality. We're born humans long before we become logical scientists. So, when we speak of embodied cognition, or maybe embodied knowledge or perception, this is really a return to something that has been sidestepped by serious thinkers for generations. We're talking about the idea that consciousness is more than what exists in your brain chatter. Now, there is a type of cogniting intelligence that exists not only within your body, but within the way your body perceives and reacts to its environment. Part 2, Problem 1. Okay, so back in step 54, we discussed that through fMRI scans, scientists can actually tell that when we pause to deliberate before making a big decision, our brain is only producing electrical chatter. It's not actually thought that is happening in that moment. Now, this points to the notion that the decision is either made before we begin deliberation, or maybe it's made in some way that's not related to the brain, which is even crazier. Now, this is both crazy and freeing at the same time, but mostly the implications of this are very profound if every time you're making a decision, there is really nothing going on in your head. Now, fascinatingly enough, in the philosophies of existentialism and surrealism, they both acknowledge that when we're making difficult decisions, there seems to be a void at the moment of decision, an emptiness when it is time to make the decision. Now, consider that, really, from your own experience. Have you ever made a decision and just the rationality just disappears? And then you say something. Now, existentialists claim that emptiness is a sign of freedom to make a choice, while the surrealists are going to say that emptiness means there are no reasons at all. It's all chance, that choice is an illusion. Now, Murdoch says that when we have to make a difficult decision, mostly what we're doing is enacting the behavior of thinking. We have actually learned to pause and maybe stroke our beards or squint our eyes and perhaps look upward with an out-of-focus gaze. Yeah, we adopt the posture of deliberation. And this is, of course, learned by watching others pretend to think, right? Murdoch says the deciding was already done previously. The deciding was done day by day in a piecemeal fashion as we assemble who we are, we make ourselves, and we assemble how we're going to react when that big decision comes. And we do this day by day through little habits and interactions. She says you are free, you have freedom, but it's in the seemingly small, inconsequential actions of your daily life. But when that big moral choice comes and you enter this strange state of emptiness, well, maybe it seems like your will moves of its own accord, right? And this is kind of strange to think about, but it really doesn't look to rationality, and it doesn't resemble logical thought processes. It just kind of happens. So who or what took over and made that decision?
Part 2. Problem 2.
Ian McGilchrist, he wrote this amazingly thick book that I purchased and I have not yet read. It is called The Master and the Emissary. Now, I did listen to some podcasts where he talked about the left brain, right brain split. And of course, we probably all learned about this in school, but and I need to throw out a caveat here real quick before I go any further. Robert Sapolsky, who wrote the book Behave, he actually sort of says this left brain, right brain thing is overplayed. So, I mean, you can take this entire next section with a grain of salt, but I still think it's kind of fascinating. The right brain is the master who lets his emissary, the left brain, do all the talking. Yeah, so this now more specialized, rational left brain begins to think it's in charge over time because it's talking all the time, so it thinks it's in charge, and pretty soon it won't even listen to the right brain, the master, who's trying to tell him what's going on. So what I tend to do in situations like this is I imagine somebody like a King Arthur character who's like shooing off Merlin, right? Because, no, excuse me, Merlin, I'm in the middle of a real knee slapper here. Just go away. So now we've got this left side of the brain, which, as we know, controls the right side of the body. And this handles math and facts and sequences and logic, and the left side of the brain articulates language. But the right brain can also understand the language. So this is kind of interesting because the right side of the brain, it's more holistic. It handles feelings, intuition. It's often seen as creative. Now, you might ask, how do we know all this? Well, this is where I think it gets really interesting. There's been these experiments conducted in the 1960s, roughly, by this guy named Roger Sperry. And this is with humans who had their corpus callosum, that is the interchange between the hemispheres of your brain. It had to be cut to prevent epileptic seizures. So this bundle of nerves, it's severed between the right and left brain. And then what we find is that both sides of the body try to control themselves differently. So, for instance, if the left hand, which is controlled by the right brain with feelings and imagination and holistic thinking, now this left hand is put into a box and the person is told to grab a tool. So let's say this left hand, once again controlled by the right brain, grabs a hammer. So when the person is asked what the left hand is holding, the person actually says something like, a banana. Like, what? So this is the left side of the brain talking as if it knows what's going on because the left brain controls speech centers. So the left brain is pretending to know to be in control, so it just lies. This is crazy. Now, to make this even stranger, the left hand, right? This hand still holding the hammer, it's going to reach over and try to start helping. It wants to show the other side of the brain what's going on, that it's actually holding, it's not holding a banana. But the left side of the brain will deny its help and continue lying, proclaiming things like it's been deceived. Merlin tricked me again. It's so dumb. So earlier I said our brain is a liar, but it's not really the whole brain, right? It's mostly the left side, the talking side, the logic side, which coincidentally is also the self-deception and confabulation part of the brain. That's right, culturally, through science and philosophy, we have given control to a liar who uses his logic and math. But, maybe we should also restrict his authority a little, put some checks on the emissary, put some balances in place here, and give some more reign over to the master.
Part 3. Embodied perception.
So how about some definitions here? Embodied knowledge. This is the idea that the body has its own knowledge that is quicker and more embedded than rationality. This is also related to embodied perception, right? Which is that the body is actually collecting sensory data from your environment by engaging with it and moving through it. So, question for you. Have you ever moved before you knew something was wrong? Did you just sort of act without thinking? Perhaps you just felt something that later turned out to be wise, but at the time you weren't actually thinking at all. Now, this can be considered embodied perception. Your body's autonomic systems, your automatic nervous systems, they pick up on cues before your rational mind can even process them, and without the intervention or judgment of your brain. Now, how far does this sort of perception extend? Matthew Crawford discusses, on a small scale, how our brain ceases to differentiate between a tool and our hand. The tool merely becomes an extension of our perception, an extension of our hand. So the other day, for instance, I was sawing through a piece of wood, and as I approached the edge, I suddenly just stopped. I didn't think about stopping, I just did. Some part of me felt through the saw blade that if I kept going, the wood would splinter outward, leaving this kind of blowout I would have to repair later. So this was instinctual, this was bodily knowledge. Over time, through familiarity, our perceptual range can extend, and this kind of environmental range and our perception, they can really expand to new sensitivities. So a primary point that Crawford makes is that perceiving is a way of acting. Perception is not something that happens to us or in us. It is something we do. So this really explicitly rejects the assumption that the mind interprets perception. The mind doesn't get involved in it. The body does it all through action and movement, which means we perceive through the body, and it is filtering knowledge. So about a year ago, I listened to this, I thought was a really great podcast, The Philosopher's Zone, and this was on neurophenomenology and sense-making. Yeah, and we're not going to cover all that, so don't worry. But in our techno-rationalized world, we tend to look for the one bolt that caused the problem. Now, this is a very reductive, isolationist way of thinking that really fails to account for systemic variables and multiple cascading failures and reactions. But, of course, your body, on the other hand, is actually built for this holistic environmental sense-making, and it tends to hold knowledges that often supersede what your logical brain can tell you. So speaking of neurophenomenology, in the podcast, he quotes a guy named Claxton, who talks of the body is a massive, seeing, streaming collection of interconnected communicating systems that binds the muscles, the stomach, the heart, and the sensors in the brain so tightly together that no part, especially the brain, can be seen as functioning separate from or senior to any other part. So yeah, one of these examples given by Brad Roberts, who has actually written his PhD thesis on this, is this Piper Alpha oil rig explosion, where 167 people died in this explosion and 62 survived. Now, those who survived, they were trying to study what they did, and they reacted to the felt heat and flames, and they jumped into the ocean, while those who perished were actually insulated from the heat and they waited for rescue. So those who perished had an impoverished perception of the environment. Or we can talk about Captain Sully Sullenberger, the pilot who saved all those people by crash landing in the Hudson River. Now, he was reacting at the moment to an emerging situation, reacting very quickly, but after years of flying and practicing belly landings, he knew the correct glide path for the plane. He had already mastered the technical proficiency which allowed him to react instinctually and land the plane. So this is interesting to me because it sounds like rational thinking. I mean, in hindsight, of course it does. I have the skills and knowledge, I recognize the situation, I make a judgment, and I react. Yet, of course, Crawford says, at high speeds, judgment is not the right word to use because the reaction is just too fast. Cognitive activity is costly and it takes time. Instead, you literally feel the situation to process the data. So you're, say, on a motorcycle, and you feel your back tire slip. I mean, do you rationally compute that? 1.5 degrees counterlateral force applied for 1.2 parsecs. Oh, no, right? We don't do that. Now, Crawford discusses robot design to really sort of talk about how this works, about the body versus computation. Now, a robot has to interact with its environment. Now, the old-fashioned way to do this was to compute all the variables before and during and after the movement. That's a lot of computation. It's grossly inefficient. And as we know from things like behavioral economics and evolutionary science, thinking requires a lot of energy. And actually, humans are designed to run in passive mode as much as possible. So how are we getting around all this computation? Well, robot designers are now following this more evolutionary model. They find that the right design, the physicality of the design, imparts feedback more efficiently than computation. For instance, with a little bit of gravity on a downhill slope, a human can walk with virtually zero energy. Each step imparts more information through the movement. By moving, it tracks incline, increased or decreased gait. It tracks the terrain, it tracks resistance, right? All these kind of things. Now, apply this evolutionary design to a robot, and the mechanics of movement themselves impart information at a much lower energy cost and reduced computation. This is super fascinating. Now, to hammer the movement aspect home just a little bit more, Crawford also talks a lot about sight and movement and how they're interconnected, right? He has cited these really weird developmental examples with kittens on merry-go-rounds, and it's kind of weird, and we're not going to get into it, but the short of it is that we actually perceive three-dimensionality through movement. Our awareness and cognition are through mapping the environment, engaging what the environment provides. When we perceive in an idiom of possibilities for movement. So yeah, when your motorcycle slips on that damn banana peel, you gyroscopically correct for it. It's almost as if the bike is your body and you just react. As you move through your environment, perceiving possibilities, you realize, for instance, you can't correct to the left without hitting oncoming traffic. And you account for this somehow through awareness of your space and your environment without really rationally even considering it. Now, we do all of this, this is the kicker, to save the old noggin, right? The old homunculus between the ears, which of course was dumb enough to get you onto a motorcycle to begin with. Now, of course, on a much larger scale, when we're moving and taking into account the possibilities our environment affords to us, such as perhaps knowing that the Hudson River is up ahead and being familiar enough with the plane to do a belly landing, that all allows Captain Sully Sullenberger to save 155 people. Part 4 Recap. So, at this point, as a recap, we're casting into doubt the over-reliance on internal logic. Because really, at the end of the day, it's quite messy the way emotions and instinctual behaviors interact with your brain, right? It's not purely rational. Now, once again, we are a seething communication system, so tightly bound the body and brain are really just inseparable. Yet, of course, we keep trying to separate them out to make sense of them. Sure, your I or identity, your you, it might be influenced by reason, but at that vital moment, your logical rationality may either choose to take a back seat, just disappear and shut up, or when it's really confused and scared, it might just start lying. So here's the deal. We know that philosophy has often pretended to be logical and scientific, and it attempts to ascribe these features to us. And of course, we also like to appeal to rationality as a guide, but maybe we aren't actually being rational when we do this. Now, as humans, our societal championing of logic has also led us into these cul-de-sacs of harm. We're often plagued with bureaucratic inefficiency, reduction of people into functions or tools that are just abused. And of course, our behavioral economic knowledge is often used for propaganda and manipulation. And of course, if we're left alone in our heads constructing stories, we become fragile and we react with insecurity. Now, of course, we can all say that the fault stems from logic, and this is logic tainted with capitalism or human urges. We just need more logic to fix it, right? And of course, that is slowly happening. It's great, but it's an uphill battle because we have made a society based on efficiency and utility. And there's very little incentive to study things that cannot be measured and monetized and made useful. So what about things like, movement without action? How about deliberation without decision? Morality or virtue that isn't for sale? Now, fortunately, Science has progressed, and with more sensitive instruments, scientists and neurophysicists are now investigating these sort of more discarded phenomena, such as the instinct that saves lives or the moment of choice. And this kind of draws them back from this edge, this kind of superstitious hocus pocus kind of area, into more valid concepts. However, this shows that there really isn't anything that looks like thought on these fMRI machines whenever we're deliberating a big decision, which leads us to reconsider what's happening at the moment of choice. So 1, you can declare your will acted of its own accord. This implies that the real you is your unthinking will, your inner urges, and it's enacting your morality or values, but it's definitely not beholden to reason, right? Because your reason just disappeared during the moment of choice. So this means the real you is irrational. That's scary. Now, part 2. Through embodied cognition, your body actually made the decision, and we can call this an instinct. Once again, this is kind of irrational from a classical understanding of reason or logic. Or kind of maybe more as we're proposing here as this kind of super duper amateur podcaster guy, you might actually kind of take all this left brain, right brain discussion and consider a different conclusion. That actually sort of a more holistic non-language part of you is weighing in. The master might actually be taking over from the emissary. Now, it's not that this part cannot be fooled or be wrong. It is, after all, evolutionarily adapted to maybe a savanna and not really a dense urban population where there's a lot of driving while on cell phones. And of course, they didn't have a whole lot of banana peels on sidewalks back then. So, take that with a grain of salt. But perhaps we have let the little demon between our ears, this little homunculus, right? Maybe he's been doing too much driving. Perhaps we have not actually set ourselves up for mastery and flow, which are actually bodily and right brain. Now let's consider integrating some of that other forms of knowledge, like use your embodied perception, use your whole self, right? Sure, keep your reason, but supplement it with the rest of your being. Expand your cognition through your body. Perhaps get to know the right brain version of yourself. And if you're looking for a little life hack to be better, well, how about this? There's a whole nother half of your brain just sitting there in a body that's probably just sitting there too. Put them to use. Now, this may actually end up expanding who you are and how you relate to the world. And at the same time, it might ground you in a richer reality than your illusory mental models can ever devise. Hey everybody, thank you so much for sticking with me. I thought I was going to be able to fit in how design facilitates agency or cripples our agency by really shaping the way that we interact with the world, but that was a little too much. But of course, it naturally ties directly to this embodied cognition and experience. So let's discuss this first as a warm-up. Next episode is going to be on this design facilitating agency idea and how that reacts with your body. So my goal here is not merely to do things like seed doubt, but the goal that we're really trying to approach, through Crawford, of course, is to have us question our base assumptions so we can live a thriving, fuller existence and hopefully become better, stronger, more capable individuals. Now, for this episode, I wanted to show how we're often not rational when it counts the most, and by accepting and opening ourselves to reliance on the body and alternate forms of intelligence, body and brain, we can actually be a bit more well-rounded and prepared as we encounter the world. So if you enjoyed this episode or you found it worthwhile, please take a moment to hop on letusthinkaboutit.com and subscribe. You're going to only receive one email per month, and that's where I share what I'm consuming, producing, reading, and current episodes. And that's about it. And of course, you can unsubscribe at any time. And of course, lest we forget, you can also subscribe to my other project, bellybuttonlint.blog, to get daily wads of fuzzy wisdom delivered directly to your inbox. All right, this is Ryder Richards. Until next time, stay safe.